That Friday night remains etched in my memory as one of the most intense and unforgettable nights of my life. The house was unusually quiet, offering a rare sense of calm. Exhausted from a long week, I craved nothing more than sleep. As I lay down, I thought nothing could disturb the stillness. I had been a single mother for 8 years since my divorce. My ex-husband and I didn't part on bad terms, we simply grew apart. Raising Daniel alone had been both the most rewarding and challenging experience of my life. He was everything to me, smart, funny, and kind. But being both mother and father to him was no small task. That night, I was so drained I barely managed to change into my pajamas before collapsing into bed. The house was silent. Daniel had gone to bed hours earlier after finishing his homework and playing video games. Finally alone in my room, I savored the moment. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. I nestled under the blanket, enjoying its warmth as my mind wandered. Life had been calm lately, a welcome change after a difficult year. Daniel and I had weathered so much together since his father left, but we'd built a good life. Even at nearly 20, he remained thoughtful and caring, though I sometimes worried he carried too much responsibility for someone his age. A smile tugged at my lips as I thought of him. He was such a kind soul, and I felt lucky to have him in my life. But tonight, exhaustion won out. My body felt heavy, my eyelids drooping as sleep began to claim me. Then, a soft knock at my bedroom door jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but the knock came again, gentle yet insistent. "Mom!" Daniel's voice was quiet but enough to rouse me. I blinked, trying to focus on the door. In the dim hallway light, I could make out his silhouette. "Daniel, what's wrong?" My voice was thick with sleep. He hesitated before stepping inside and closing the door softly behind him. "I couldn't sleep," he murmured, avoiding my gaze as he stood near the bed. A pang of worry struck me. Since the divorce, Daniel had occasionally struggled with sleep, but he rarely spoke about it. His father's absence had hurt him more than he let on, and tonight, sadness lingered in his eyes. "Come here," I said softly, patting the space beside me. "You can stay with me tonight if you want." He hesitated before lying down next to me, facing me in the dim light. He looked tired and vulnerable in a way that wasn't typical for him. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked gently. Daniel shook his head, his dark hair falling over his eyes. "No," he whispered. "I just wanted to be close to you." My heart warmed at his words. It had been a while since he'd sought this kind of closeness like when he was younger. Reaching out, I brushed his hair back and smiled at him. "That's okay," I whispered, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You can stay as long as you need." He offered a faint smile in return, but something unspoken still lingered in his expression, something he wasn't ready to share. Instead of pressing him, I lay back down and pulled the blanket over us both, letting the quiet comfort us. We lay there in peaceful silence until Daniel's breathing slowed, and I thought he'd fallen asleep. But then he spoke again, so softly I almost missed it. "Mom, do you ever miss him?" The question caught me off guard, but I knew he meant his father, a topic we'd both avoided for years. "I do sometimes," I admitted quietly. "But things weren't good between us, Daniel. You know that." He nodded but seemed to want more. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" I sighed, thinking about past regrets. "Maybe, but we can't change what happened. We have to move forward." Daniel looked down, fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. I just wonder if maybe I could have done something different, like if I'd been better." His words pierced my heart. Sitting up, I turned to face him squarely. "Daniel," I said firmly, "this wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." He looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it feels like if I'd been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left." Tears welled in my eyes as I pulled him into a tight hug. He resisted for a moment but then clung to me, burying his face in my shoulder. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling with emotion, "your dad made his own choices. It had nothing to do with you. It was never your responsibility." My voice softened as I held him closer. "You've always been more than enough for me. You're everything to me." He nodded against my shoulder, but I could still feel the tension in him, the weight of years of unspoken pain and guilt. We held each other closely as silence settled between us like a comforting blanket. Gradually, his body relaxed against mine, His breathing deepened as he drifted off to sleep. But as he slept peacefully beside me, my mind raced with thoughts and memories swirling in the darkness. We had both endured so much together, and yet there was something new stirring within me as we shared that quiet embrace. An unexpected warmth spreading through my chest. A connection that felt deeper than our usual bond as mother and son. I tried to dismiss it, to focus on the rhythm of his breathing, but it lingered like a whisper that refused to be ignored. Morning arrived too soon. Soft light painted the room in gentle hues as dawn broke outside our window, where we lay together, still wrapped up tightly under blankets warmed by shared body heat, while outside birds sang their morning songs, heralding another day ahead filled with possibilities yet unknown. A sense of pride lingered, yet beneath the surface of my maternal affection, an unfamiliar feeling persisted, a quiet undercurrent I couldn't ignore. I slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Daniel, and made my way downstairs to prepare breakfast. The familiar rhythm of cooking breakfast brought a sense of normalcy, but my thoughts kept drifting back to our late-night conversation. Daniel had always been sensitive, yet I hadn't fully realized how deeply he'd carried the weight of his father's absence. His guilt pressed heavily on me, a burden I wished I could shoulder for him. But it wasn't just his pain that occupied my mind. It was the way he'd looked at me, the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and the unspoken longing that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of our relationship. And if I was honest with myself, the warmth I'd felt while holding him had stirred something deep within me, a connection that defied easy explanation. I tried to push the thought aside, reminding myself he was my son, but the feeling lingered like a quiet hum I couldn't silence. Daniel emerged from his room shortly after, his hair disheveled and his lanky frame still bearing traces of adolescence. Yet there was a new maturity in his eyes, a quiet strength that hinted at the man he was becoming. I greeted him with a warm smile, masking the emotions that had lingered since the night before. "Morning, sleepyhead," I said, setting a plate of pancakes in front of him. "Morning," he mumbled, sliding into his chair and digging into his breakfast. We ate in comfortable silence, the morning light casting a golden glow over the kitchen. I noticed his gaze lingering on me occasionally, but I chose not to bring up the previous night. He seemed more at ease now, more like himself, and I didn't want to disrupt the fragile peace we'd found. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Thanks for last night, Mom," he said softly, his voice sincere. I needed that." His vulnerability caught me off guard. "You never have to thank me," I replied gently. "I'll always be there for you no matter what." He nodded but kept his eyes fixed on me, an unspoken question hanging in the air. I wasn't sure how to respond or how to navigate this subtle shift between us. There was a new intensity in his gaze, a yearning for a connection that seemed to stretch beyond the roles we'd always known. And if I was honest with myself, a part of me felt it too. After breakfast, he lingered at the counter, his fingers tracing idle patterns on the surface. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" he asked quietly, his voice heavy with unspoken emotions. I sighed, the weight of past regrets settling over me. "Maybe," I admitted softly, "but we can't change what happened. All we can do is try to move forward." Daniel nodded but kept his gaze fixed on his restless hands. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have done something, been better, you know." His voice was barely a whisper, laced with guilt and self-reproach. His words pierced my heart. Without thinking, I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, drawing him into a gentle embrace. "Daniel," I said firmly, my voice thick with emotion, "you didn't do anything wrong. None of this was your fault." He looked away, his voice barely audible. "Sometimes it feels like if I had been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left." Tears welled up in my eyes as I pulled him closer, holding him tightly. He resisted for a moment before surrendering to the embrace, burying his face in my shoulder. "Listen to me," I said firmly. "Your father's choices were his own. You are and always have been more than enough. His leaving had nothing to do with you." He nodded slowly, his body relaxing against mine as the tension in his shoulders gradually eased. In that moment, an unfamiliar warmth rose within me again, a mix of relief, affection, and something deeper that neither of us could name. The bond between us, once defined by clear roles, seemed to be shifting into something new, something neither of us fully understood but both instinctively felt. For now, I held him close, letting the moment linger without questions or explanations. Life, as we had known it, was changing, and this was just the beginning. As dawn arrived with its gentle insistence, sunlight filtered through the curtains and roused me from sleep. Beside me, Daniel slept peacefully, his face serene as if the burdens of the previous night had been forgotten for now. I watched him for a moment, my heart swelling with familiar maternal love, yet beneath that well-known affection stirred something else entirely, an unfamiliar sensation that both intrigued and unsettled me. I slipped out of bed quietly, so as not to disturb him, and made my way downstairs to begin breakfast, once more a routine that offered comfort amidst all these shifting emotions swirling inside me like leaves caught in an autumn breeze. A change in Daniel had become evident, a yearning for closeness that seemed to transcend traditional boundaries. If I was honest with myself, I had felt it too. There was a warmth that spread through me when I held him, a comfort that went beyond maternal instinct. "He's just a boy," I reminded myself firmly. "Your son," but the feeling lingered like a quiet hum in the back of my mind. Daniel finally emerged from his room later that morning, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His hair was tousled, a picture of youthful innocence, yet there was a newfound maturity in his gaze, a hint of the man he was becoming. "Morning," he mumbled as he settled into his chair. "Morning," I replied warmly, placing a plate of golden pancakes before him. We ate in comfortable silence, once more as sunlight bathed the kitchen in its soft glow, a fleeting moment of calm amidst all that remained unspoken between us. I could feel Daniel's eyes on me occasionally, but I remained silent, unwilling to unravel the complexities of the previous night's revelations. He seemed more at ease now, more like himself, and I didn't want to disturb this fragile peace we had found. Finally, he broke the silence again. "Thanks for last night," he said softly but steadily this time, then added after some hesitation, "It meant everything." His gratitude surprised yet touched deeply within, though words failed momentarily before managing simply enough. "You're welcome, sweetheart. Always will be here whenever needed." We shared another brief glance across tabletop-laden plates filled, remnants meal consumed together, neither daring speak further lest break spell woven round them. During these precious moments spent side by side, sharing simple pleasures life offered despite complexities lurking beneath surface, waiting patiently their turn emerge once more when least expected. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what." He nodded, but his gaze lingered, a silent question hanging between us, mirroring the emotions I had been grappling with. His eyes held a depth that went beyond the familiar comfort of our mother-son bond. The day passed quietly. Daniel retreated to his room, absorbed in homework and video games, while I busied myself with household chores. Yet, something intangible had shifted, a quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement of the deeper connection that had emerged. As evening settled in, my thoughts drifted back to Daniel, to his transformation from boy to young man, to the closeness we had shared the night before. The more I reflected, the more I realized my feelings for him had evolved in ways I couldn't easily define. After dinner, we settled on the couch to watch a movie. The room was dimly lit, the flickering screen casting dancing shadows across the walls. We sat in comfortable silence, but as the movie progressed, I became acutely aware of his proximity, the way his arm brushed against mine with each subtle shift. My heart quickened, and though I tried to focus on the film, the tension between us was palpable. Halfway through, Daniel shifted closer, his arm pressing against mine. This time he didn't move away. The warmth of his skin sent a shiver through me. I glanced at him, and our eyes met, his gaze filled with an intensity that mirrored emotions I had been trying to suppress all day. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. Our fingers intertwined as he squeezed gently, his thumb tracing slow circles on my skin. The simple gesture stirred something deep within me, a sensation both familiar and exhilaratingly new. We sat like that for a while, hands clasped in the dim light, a silent testament to the shifting dynamics of our relationship. It was a turning point, a moment of unspoken understanding that transcended our familial roles. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew things were changing. Daniel was no longer just my son. He was someone I cared for in a way that defied definition. The movie ended, but we remained on the couch as the credits rolled unnoticed. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. It was a small gesture, yet profoundly intimate, a silent acknowledgement of a connection blossoming between us. "Mom," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah, I I'm really glad you're here." His words were simple yet profound, echoing sentiments deep within my own heart. "I'm glad you're here too," I thought, silently grateful for this unexpected closeness and newfound intimacy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. As dawn arrived with gentle insistence, soft tendrils of sunlight weaving through the curtains, I stirred from slumber beside Daniel's peaceful form. His face was serene and relaxed. It seemed as though last night's burdens had been forgotten entirely by morning light alone. But beneath familiar maternal affection swelled something else entirely. An unfamiliar current stirring beneath well-worn love, an intriguing yet unsettling sensation dancing at edges where awareness meets uncertainty. And so began another ordinary day filled with breakfast preparations while thoughts drifted back toward late-night conversations shared between us, two souls navigating uncharted waters together. The weight of my husband's absence, the guilt Daniel had carried for so long, and the secret he had kept hidden now pressed heavily on my heart. But there was more to it than that. I noticed a shift in him, in the way he sought comfort in my arms, in the way he seemed to yearn for a closeness that went beyond traditional boundaries. And if I was honest with myself, I felt it too. There was a warmth that spread through me when I held him, a comfort deeper than mere maternal instinct. "He's just a boy," I reminded myself. "Your son." But the feeling lingered, a quiet whisper that refused to be silenced. Daniel finally stirred from his slumber, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His hair was tousled, a picture of youthful innocence, yet there was a newfound maturity in his gaze, a hint of the man he was becoming. I greeted him with a warm smile, masking the emotions that had lingered since the night before. "Morning, sleepyhead," I said cheerfully, placing a plate of golden pancakes before him. "Morning," he mumbled, settling into his chair and eagerly digging into his breakfast. We ate in comfortable silence, sunlight bathing the kitchen in a soft glow. Occasionally, I felt his eyes on me but stayed quiet, not ready to confront what had unfolded between us. He seemed more at ease now, more like himself, and I didn't want to disrupt this fragile peace we had found. Finally, he broke the silence again, his voice tinged with gratitude. "Thanks for last night, Mom. I needed that." His vulnerability caught me off guard once more. "You never have to thank me," I reassured him softly. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what." He nodded, but his gaze lingered, a silent question hanging in the air, a reflection of the unspoken emotions I had been grappling with. His eyes held a depth and intensity that went beyond the familiar comfort of our mother-son bond. The day passed uneventfully. Daniel retreated to his room, immersed in homework and video games, while I busied myself with household chores. Yet, something between us had shifted, an intangible change, a quiet tension that acknowledged the deeper connection we had begun to explore. As evening fell, my thoughts returned to Daniel, to his transformation from boy to young man, and to the closeness we had shared the night before. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized my feelings for him had evolved in ways I couldn't quite define. They transcended the boundaries of maternal love. After dinner, we settled on the couch to watch a movie. The room was dimly lit, the flickering images casting dancing shadows across the walls. We sat mostly in silence, content in each other's presence. But as the movie progressed, I became acutely aware of his proximity, the way his arm brushed against mine with every subtle shift. My heart quickened as I tried to focus on the film, but the tension between us was palpable, a silent symphony of unspoken emotions. Halfway through the movie, Daniel shifted closer, his arm pressing against mine. This time he didn't move away. The warmth of his skin sent a shiver through me, a sensation both familiar and startlingly new. I glanced at him, and our eyes met. His gaze was filled with an intensity that mirrored my own unspoken feelings. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. Our fingers intertwined naturally, as if they had always belonged together. He didn't resist. Instead, he squeezed my hand gently, his thumb tracing slow circles on my skin. The simple gesture sent a flutter through my heart, a feeling both comforting and exhilarating. We sat like that for a while, hands clasped in the dim light, a silent testament to the shifting dynamics of our relationship. It was a turning point, a moment of unspoken understanding that transcended our familial roles. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew things were changing. Daniel was no longer just my son. He was something more, someone I cared for in a way that defied definition. When the movie ended, we remained on the couch as the credits rolled unnoticed. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. It was a small gesture, yet profoundly intimate, a silent acknowledgement of the connection blossoming between us. "Mom," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah, I'm really glad you're here." His words were simple yet profound, an echo of what lay in my own heart. "I'm glad you're here too," I replied softly. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly alive, free from confusion or guilt. There was only this undeniable truth. Our love for one another, a love born from years of shared experiences and trust, ran deeper than blood or labels or societal expectations. Later that night, after dinner was cleared away and the house settled into quiet stillness, Daniel and I found ourselves on the back porch beneath a sky full of stars. The air was crisp and cool. Above us stretched an endless canvas dotted with shimmering lights. We didn't speak much. Words weren't necessary anymore. Simply being near each other, sharing this tranquil moment under nature's vast expanse, felt like enough. For now, at least, there were no answers, no resolutions, just this fragile, beautiful connection, waiting patiently for whatever came next. There was no urgency, no pressure, just a comfortable silence that spoke volumes. Whatever this was between us, it unfolded organically, and I was content to let it blossom at its own pace. He reached for my hand, his touch sending warmth through me like wildfire. I smiled, squeezing his hand gently, and we sat there, fingers intertwined, bathed in the soft glow of starlight. It was a love that defied definition, a connection that transcended the boundaries of our familial roles. In that moment, under the vast expanse of the night sky, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As the days turned into weeks, the intimacy between us deepened, weaving its way into the fabric of our daily lives. We didn't need to label it or define it, it simply was. It was in the way our eyes met, in the lingering touches, in the quiet moments we shared, creating a world that belonged only to us. With each passing day, the connection grew stronger, more tangible. The conflict I had initially felt dissolved, replaced by a sense of rightness, a feeling that this was where I was meant to be. Daniel was no longer just my son. He was my partner, my confidant, my lover. Our relationship had blossomed into something beautiful, something that fulfilled a need we hadn't even known we had. It wasn't until a rainy afternoon in late autumn that the full realization of our love washed over me. The sky was a canvas of stormy grays, the rain drumming a steady rhythm against the windows. Daniel and I were curled up on the couch in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. We were wrapped in a blanket, the warmth of the fire and the intimacy of our closeness creating a haven from the storm outside. Daniel leaned against me, his head resting on my shoulder, and I absently ran my fingers through his hair, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment. The rain-streaked windows blurred the outside world, creating a sense of seclusion, of being in our own little universe. I could feel his breathing slow and steady, and I knew without a word spoken that he felt the same shift in our connection, the same undeniable pull toward something more profound. He lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment, the truth of our love resonated between us. He nodded but held my gaze longer than usual, a silent question hanging between us like an unspoken confession mirrored from my own heartache these past weeks, months even? Years maybe. His eyes burned brighter somehow. Not just familiar comfort anymore, but something deeper now too, something raw, real. Morning came too fast after such restless sleep. Soft light spilled across bed sheets still tangled together where we'd lain side by side all night without touching once, yet feeling closer than ever before somehow. Then breakfast passed quietly enough, though neither one dared look directly at another during those awkward moments, spent chewing toast slowly while pretending not notice how much space suddenly seemed separating two people who used to share everything so easily. By noon, Daniel disappeared upstairs again, likely to do homework, leaving me alone downstairs, folding laundry while my mind wandered. I wondered if things might ever return to normal between us, or if they had already shifted irrevocably last night when neither of us could bring ourselves to say goodbye properly after dinner ended earlier than expected. Neither of us had much of an appetite. As evening settled in, soft and quiet, memories flooded back unbidden. Laughter over silly jokes, late nights spent watching bad movies, curled up together beneath blankets, warmed by nothing but each other's presence. Now here we were again, sitting side by side, staring blankly at the television screen. Some forgettable rom-com played, its plotlines too dull to hold our attention. I doubted either of us could recall the characters' names 5 minutes later, let alone hours from now. But then halfway through the second act, something shifted. A subtle movement beside me caught my breath in my throat. I became acutely aware of how close we were sitting, despite my earlier attempts to maintain some distance. Heat radiated from his skin mere inches away, sending shivers down my spine. Without thinking, I leaned closer until our shoulders brushed lightly, sending sparks through me. "Mom!" His voice was barely audible above the blaring soundtrack, drowned out by the pounding of my heart threatening to burst from my chest. "Yeah," I managed to croak out weakly, hoping I didn't sound as terrified as I felt. My hands trembled as they clutched the armrests, knuckles white from the strain of holding myself together. "I am," he stammered uncertainly before finding the courage to continue, his voice soft, almost reverent. "Love you." Tears welled up instantly, spilling freely down my cheeks and staining the fabric beneath my chin. The salty trails marked the passage of time, irreversible and undeniable. "Love you too, baby." I choked out brokenly, wrapping my arms tightly around his waist and pulling him snug against me. I held him protectively, shielding him from harm as I always had, as I always would. Silence reigned supreme afterward, broken only by the occasional muffled sniffle or sob escaping lips pressed firmly closed. I was determined to keep my composure intact, at least outwardly, for his sake. It wasn't just love. It was a bond that transcended the roles we'd always known, a connection that had deepened into something profound, something undeniable. "Mom!" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I remained silent, holding my breath, sensing that whatever he said next would change everything between us. "I love you," he confessed, his hand finding mine. "Not just because you're my mom, but because of who you are. Everything about you. And I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I can't stop it." His words washed over me, warm and overwhelming, filling the room with a love that made my chest ache in the most bittersweet way. I'd sensed his feelings before, but hearing them aloud made them impossible to ignore. I squeezed his hand, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my fingers. "Daniel," I murmured, my voice trembling. "I love you too. I always have, but this is different." He nodded, his eyes searching mine for reassurance, for answers to questions neither of us could fully put into words. "I don't know what this means," I admitted, "but I know how I feel. And it doesn't feel wrong to me, it feels right." A faint smile touched his lips, and my heart swelled with a joy I hadn't known existed. "I'm glad," he whispered, "because I don't know what I'd do if you didn't feel the same." I reached up, brushing my fingers against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my touch. "We'll figure this out," I said softly. Together. For a moment, we sat in silence, our gazes locked as rain tapped gently against the window and the fire crackled in the hearth. Words weren't needed. Everything had already been said. We both knew what we felt, and we both knew it was real. Daniel leaned in slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. His kiss was soft, tentative, a quiet expression of all the love and longing we'd held back for so long. There was no rush, no urgency, just the two of us, wrapped in a moment that felt both fragile and unshakable. When he pulled away, his eyes were filled with emotion, and I knew we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But instead of fear, I felt peace, a quiet certainty that this was where we were meant to be. He drew me closer then, his arms wrapping around me as we held each other tight. The rain fell steadily outside, and the firelight bathed us in its glow. In that moment, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we'd face it together. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of quiet touches and whispered words. We didn't talk about the future or what this might mean for us. All that mattered was now the closeness we shared, the intimacy of this fragile new beginning. As the rain continued its gentle rhythm outside, I marveled at how much had changed between us. Daniel had grown from a boy into a man, and in doing so, our bond had transformed into something unexpected, something beautiful and uncharted. That night, Daniel came to my room again, but this time without hesitation. He slipped into bed beside me, his arms encircling me as he held me close. We weren't mother and son anymore. We were equals, two souls intertwined in a way that defied explanation. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath me. A sense of peace settled over us, filling the air with a quiet contentment I hadn't known I was missing. For the first time in years, I felt whole, complete in a way that left no room for doubt or fear. Whatever this was, whatever it became, I was ready to embrace it fully because deep down, I knew it was real, undeniable, and unshakable. No matter what came next, we'd face it side by side, hand in hand, heart to heart, always and forever. Daniel and I had always been close, but now we were something more, something that defied definition. We were partners, lovers, two souls bound by a love that transcended convention. As sleep claimed me that night, a small smile curved my lips. It was crazy, I knew that, but it also felt like coming home.